Have you ever made cards that are just too good to send? I'm doing today's video in two parts. In the first part, I'm sharing a new fun fold design that's easy, adaptable, and impressive. In the second part, I'll show you how I made the background paper that I used, but the fun fold works just as well with pattern paper or even solid paper. This is the Circle Flip Fun Fold, and I found it on Patty Bennett's channel, and it looked like she found it somewhere else, so I'm not sure where it actually began. I'm going to make an A2 size because I know that's what most of you make, so I'm starting with a panel of letter-size cardstock. Because there's an inside portion, I'm using my lighter weight hammer mill cardstock so that things won't get too thick or hard to fold. I trimmed the panel into two pieces. One is 8.5 by 5.5, so just a regular A2 card base. The other one is 8 inches by 5 inches, 1/2 inch smaller on both sides. I scored the card base at 4 1/4 and I set that aside. Now this interior piece needs to be scored at 2.5, 4.5, and 6 inches. The first fold goes one way and then the other two go the other way. So you're kind of forming this shape with the biggest piece, which will be the inside back on the right. And then the three other panels kind of forming, I don't know, like a bridge or something. Next, get out your card base and your pattern paper, which is cut to your preferred front panel size. Mine is 5 inches by 3 3/4 inches. I added glue to the back, but only around the outside edges, nothing in the center, and you'll see why in a minute, but just on the outside for now. Of course, this is the panel I made with watercolors, and you can see how I made it later on if you want to, but you can use pattern paper or even just solid cardstock here. In fact, you don't have to add a panel at all if you don't want to. Next, I grabbed a fancy circle die from Stampin'. This is from a set called Spotlight on Nature, and it just has this fun edge detail. I taped it to the center of my card front and I put it through my die cutting machine. Even though I used a thinner cardstock for the card base, this is still quite a thick card front because of the watercolor cardstock, and it did take me a couple of tries. And here's a tip. Once I could see that the die was through the watercolor cardstock, I took the tape off, took out the watercolor die cut, and then I put the die back in place to cut through the white cardstock. And that's a tip that'll work anytime you want to make a window card with a layered card front. Next, I put the interior portion in. To position it correctly, I put the biggest portion of the panel onto the back of my card, and I folded the rest over, just along that first score line. So now the left edge of the interior panel is going to sit right up against the fold of the card base. Okay, let me show you again with the glue. I put liquid glue just on the back of that biggest portion, and then I folded the piece just along that first score line to the left and put the left edge along the fold line and pressed everything down so it would stick together. For the other side, we want it glued to the back of the card front so it'll have a little almost pop-up action. Of course, there's that big hole there, so I put the glue on the card front, being careful not to get too close to the edge since the interior panel is narrower than the card. You could mark the spots on the card front if you want. Then press that last portion of the interior panel into the glue and fold the card shut. I put an acrylic block on top to hold everything flat and in place while the glue dried. So now we see how the card design works, and it's time to decorate it. From, let's call it my coordinating pattern paper, I've cut a circle the same size as the hole in the front of the card, and gluing it on half of the interior panel is going to give it that flip action. First, I wanted to add a layer of white behind it to show through the holes around the edge, and to add some pops of brightness. One thing that I noticed is that my coordinating paper doesn't really have enough contrast from the striped paper I used for the front of the card. So I decided to cut a frame from some gold cardstock to help add some definition and make the design on the circle pop a little bit more. I used the larger die with that fun edge detail along with a plain circle die to create my frame. To attach the circle to that kind of pop-up mechanism, I put glue only on the right side of the score line on the cardstock that we can see through the window. And then I put the circle on it and I held it in place while the glue set a bit. You can make this a little easier by cutting the circle ever so slightly smaller than the window if you have a die that works like that. And I also think that if you're using patterned paper, which is much thinner than my watercolor cardstock, it'll be easier. But once you get the design set in the hole properly, you can see how it's going to swing as the card is opened and closed. I glued the gold frame around the window directly onto my front panel. And once again, I think I could have cut a slightly bigger opening. Everything's fitting so snugly right now that it's important to get things precisely in place and then work it a few times back and forth so that it's all moving as it should. Next, I decorated the inside of the card. I cut a piece from my circle panel that was 1 3/4 by 4 3/4 inches, and I glued it to the area directly to the left of the message portion of the card. Patty showed putting another piece on that next panel underneath the circle. Obviously, you would have to do that before you add the circle to the front, but I left that white on this one. And again, I think that due to the thickness of my cardstock, that was probably my best choice. To finish the front of the card, I cut these 2 little Gummiapan trees, one from white and one from gold, so that I could decide which one I liked better. In the end, I kind of came up with a compromise. I liked the brightness of the white, but then I added some little gold dots cut from the honey gold paper to act as ornaments. So now it's all done. Now, if there's one thing I don't love about this design, it's that when you open it, it doesn't lie completely flat. As a lefty, I'm going to have a hard time writing there, but you righties will be okay. Isn't that pretty? And you know I couldn't just not make a 4 1/4 inch square version, right? So here I used a square die rather than a circle for my window, and I tipped it so it's sitting on a point. Instead of putting a frame around the outside on the card front, I started with a gold square and then I cut my paper slightly smaller, so the gold frame is now part of that flipping mechanism of the card. I think you can see what I mean. I added a white snowflake, and this time I did put that strip on the inside, underneath the flipping portion, and it all seemed to work just fine. If you want to see how I made the watercolor panel and my ideas for changing things up a little bit, keep watching. But if you're planning to use pattern paper, or you've just had enough of my artistic experiments recently, that's okay too. And I'll say thanks for watching for now. Are they gone? Just kidding. I hope you all stuck around. I'm starting with a piece of watercolor cardstock, which I've taped off kind of 1/3 and 2/3, so I can make 2 different patterns. And I've got 4 ink refills: On the Lake, Goldenrod, Be Mine, and Juniper Mist, which I put into separate wells in my little plastic palette here. I'm going to start on the easy side, the 1/3 side, because here I just plan to do some simple narrow stripes. My brush is big, but not really wide, so I can get my stripes quite narrow, and at first I was really just kind of figuring out how much water versus how much ink for each one. A simple exercise like this is really good for getting control over these basics without having much at risk. Oh boy, that navy is dark, and the brights are really bright. I was hoping for something a little more sophisticated and rich and muted rather than a full rainbow, but I've been at this point before, so I knew the answer was to keep going. I grabbed some crumpled up plastic wrap and spritzed water onto that before pouncing it all over to give it some texture, and all it really did was pick up some of the navy ink and spread it everywhere. So that's definitely muting the colors a little bit. I spritzed water and lifted it up with a paper towel, and still those navy stripes are really taking everything over, aren't they? I tried kind of repainting them just with water, lifting it up, drying it, and it wasn't until I thought of going over it that this started to take shape. I pulled out my gold Kuretake watercolors and I painted a gold stripe over each of the navy stripes, and that definitely toned it all down. I decided that was enough for now, and I gave it a dry with my heat gun, and that also muted the colors quite a bit. I was feeling better, but not good, know what I mean? So I splattered some gold over top, and that definitely helped. At least enough that I felt like I could move on to my other side. This side is Kandinsky inspired, but also inspired again by Denise Love. I've seen her do this a couple of times, and it looks like just drawing a bunch of circles. And so far, this is looking pretty juvenile, I would say. But by now, I know that I really just have to keep going. I started with centers in each one, and then I just built concentric circles from there, changing up the colors and trying to use enough water to get some blending going. I knew the navy was going to be dark, so I tried to be really light-handed with that, but it was still pretty overpowering. After a while, I started drawing in squares around each one to fill in with one of the colors. I know this is still looking pretty rough, but what I want to say here is you really do not have to be an artist of any kind to make pretty things. The more this fills in, the better it looks, even though it's kind of muddy and random. For my next step, I actually watercolored on some gold circles, similar to adding the gold stripes on the other side. I figured it would add some shine and lighten up those darkest areas. I added some gold watercolor splatter as well, and then I moved on to add some white splatter. All these little techniques are just helping distract your eye from the fact that I really haven't done anything concrete. It's all just colors and a feeling. I peeled off the tape, which I always think helps a bit, and this is definitely pretty, but I wanted to add more, especially on the circle side. I grabbed the round Fragments stencil from a Colorful Life Designs and some apricot acrylic paint. I put one of the little shapes onto the center of a circle, but then I decided rather than trying to emphasize a circle shape by doing that, I would randomly add partial fragments around the panel. I bought some cheap blending brushes from Amazon, and they're working really nicely for putting the paint down. I feel better about using them and cleaning them rather than throwing out those cheap makeup sponges I was using last week. I still wasn't loving this pattern, so I ended up adding even more. I used some kind of red metallic watercolor, not in circles, but more like swoops around each design. And then I used some of the leftover navy ink for a dark splatter, and I think that started to help add some depth. At this point, I still wasn't loving it, so I walked away and decided to take another look in the morning. Things like this often look better in the morning. I wanted to add some more gold, so I grabbed an old Catherine Pooler stencil and masked off one of the lines of chevrons. I was deciding which circle die I was going to use to cut this down, and of course you know which one I chose already. So I placed the stencil so that each circle shape would have some of the chevrons close enough to the center that it'll be in any circle die cut I was going to do. At this point, I had 2 favorites out of the 6. Do you? Denise often says that the benefit of doing multiples like this is that there's an increased chance that you'll actually like at least one of them. I love that. I put some of the Kuretake mica gold onto my palette, and I used a blending brush to put it through the stencil, making sure that each little square got some of that pretty shine. And you know already how the card came together from here. These cards are so pretty, I don't want to send them out. I may just hold on to them until next year, just so I can look at them. If you want to change up this card design, obviously you can use a different shape than a circle. You can change the card size too. You may have to do a bit of math to get those score lines at the right place if you're doing a 5x7 card. But for my square card, the card was just shorter than an A2 card, so I was able to use the same measurements for scoring. You could use patterned paper or colored cardstock for the interior panel to get a different look. Or you could make one that's pretty much monochrome. There's lots of ways to get creative with this one. I think this fun fold is a nice balance of quick and easy, but with a bit of a surprise to make the recipient feel like they got something really special. Let me know what you think. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.